Bollywood in Peru is not an elite interest. It belongs to the struggling and the aspirational, who see their battles mirrored in the brutal, unforgiving landscape of India's classic cinema. It is a cinema that goes from the 1950s onwards to the 1980s, where dreams are broken by destiny, wealth is no protection from the whims of the gods, and even the powerful are at the mercy of the stars. Since the advent of neoliberalism in the 1990s, however, Bollywood's excessive materialism mimics Hollywood's. No longer is the hero an honest villager fighting a corrupt system. Now he is a multinational brand consultant with a Rolex, whose parents celebrate their wedding anniversary by taking 100 of their closest friends on a Mediterranean cruise. But even these pornographic displays of wealth and luxury don't put off Lima's working class audiences. There is something acceptable, even exhilarating, about a brown man who makes it big. The odds are still crushingly stacked against him, and unlike Hollywood, his fall can still be bloody. There is often no happy ending. The system, no matter your riches, will not vindicate you. You might still die a pauper. You do not have the pursuit of happiness enshrined in the constitution of your life. But imagine one of your own beating fate, overpowering destiny, and transcending life, even briefly. How beautiful would that be? Shah Rukh Khan prolonged my existence for 5 years. Violetta, a 72-year-old grandmother of 14, declares dramatically as she sits down. Violetta, with short graying hair and deep-set eyes, has been a cancer patient for the last 18 years. In 2013, she was placed on radiotherapy, but it didn't take. She vomited through the nights, lost her hair, and was finally told she needed surgery on her thyroid to extract the malevolent tumor. 1 month before I was due to have the operation, my husband, the love of my life, my companion for 47 years of marriage, died. Violetta's voice chokes and tears gather in her eyes. I didn't want to live. Her daughter, Gabriella, an actress, sits beside her. She nods her head in tragic confirmation. Every day she want to die. Without him, with my illness, I had nothing in life. But then one of my granddaughters brought me a film of Shah Rukh Khan. Mi nombre es Khan. My name is Khan. Violetta watched that film, followed by another movie and another movie and another movie, staying up till 3 a.m. She's always loved movies, calling herself a fanatic, and she had appreciated Mexican, Argentinian, Spanish, even Hollywood films. But nothing she had ever seen rivaled the perfection of Cines Hindu, as they call it. I can't pass one day without Shah Rukh, Violetta swears. She actually also told me that she believes in a past life that she may have been his mother. Or his sister, she wasn't sure. Not one day of my life. I said to my granddaughter, if you bring me more films of this actor, then I will keep on living, and I will stay with you for more time. All the members of the Shah Rukh Khan Universe fan club have stories that follow this pattern of deep despair, lifted only by immersion into Khan's films. Angie, a dimpled 18-year-old who works as a teacher in a language institute and has been drafted as the translator for this gathering, interrupts her translations every now and then to promise me that she too has a very personal and very, very sad story. Angie has been calling me since I reached Lima, usually at 7:30 a.m., to discuss my plans for the day. She bombards me with continual, breathless texts to ask what it's like to be a writer, which she would like to be one day. She wants to write about values, a vanishing concept in her country. Though they all profess to admire Khan for his values, culture, and traditions, it is Wadi whose allegiance to the Bollywood star is the most profound. I am hard, Wadi emotes in his deep actor's timbre, because the men in Peru are macho. The men don't cry. But watching DDLJ for the first time, Wadi found himself awash in tears. It was a film that made him want to be an actor when he was 17 years old, lost, and on the cusp of suicide. I wanted to study acting to be like Shah Rukh, Wadi says. You can be like his shoes, Violetta calls out across the table. I just wanted to have even 1% of his grace. The whole evening, Wadi has been goofing around, speaking in Spanish-inflected Hindi, grabbing the women's hands to twirl them in a dance, and dropping to his knees to sing and shimmy his shoulders. But suddenly he grows somber. Yo soy un chico de pueblo. Wadi puts his hand on his heart. I am a man of the village. Yo no soy un Chopra. Yo no soy este Kapoor, un chico. I'm not a Chopra, I'm not a Kapoor. Wadi has been in 8 films, but it hasn't been easy. Here we have no opportunities being Inca, he says, his shoulders hunching. Here, there are only opportunities for Brad Pitt. Here, if there's anyone of our color in films, they only have a story where they come from the highlands, or they're stealing money, or they're doing something bad. If Shah Rukh Khan was born in Peru, he would have been a poor man. He could have never been the king of romance. Never. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fatma, and thank you to the Asia Society for inviting me back to the stage after many years. I worked at the Asia Society for several years, so it's really a pleasure to be back, and it's an honor to share the stage with Fatima Bhutto, of course, whose writing I'm very familiar with and whom I've read also for a long time. So thank you for those very amusing readings about especially Shah Rukh Khan's totally unprecedented popularity in places that one would never imagine. But before we get to that, I want to ask about, how is it that you came to see that Hollywood and American popular culture in general is in decline, and that these different genres from totally different traditions, you look at India, cinema, South Korea, music, and Turkey, soap operas, although they don't call them soap operas. How is it that this shift, that you noted the shift, and how it came to occur from the US to India, Turkey, and South Korea?
Well, thank you, Nermeen. It's an honor to be here talking to you. Well, I think if you live somewhere outside of the Western world, if you live somewhere outside of America or Europe, then you are divided in a way into 2 halves. At one point, you are completely overwhelmed and entertained by Western culture. I'm certainly a child of Western culture. I grew up on it, even in 1980s Syria. But at the same time, you have access to so much beyond the West. And you have access to films and music and art from all over the world, essentially. So my feeling has always been that there isn't a center in the world. And there certainly isn't a Western center. I mean, we live in a very multipolar world, except that's not the narrative that's given to us. And you only have to watch the most recent outputs to realize that it's Western culture is looking inwards and inwards and inwards and inwards to the point of collapse, almost. The example I keep giving is this new film which is going to come out that tells the story of Ethiopian refugees, but through Dakota Fanning, who is a white woman. That's a sign of its inward-lookingness, I think. And not just that, Zero Dark 30 is another movie that I always think of because it seemed so insular in its vision. I presume you've all seen a bit of Zero Dark 30? Sort of. You're not missing very much, but Zero Dark 30 is that film which claims erroneously that it was torture that helped America catch Osama bin Laden. And it does these ridiculous things in the film. So, most of it is set in Pakistan, and anytime a Pakistani sort of smiles at someone or has a nice time, something explodes in the background. There's a scene where a man is being waterboarded to within an inch of his life, and the gaze of the camera is not on the man being tortured, but on Jessica Chastain, the CIA agent, who's having a terrible time watching it, you know. And at one point, the torturer stops to go up to her and say, "Are you okay?" She says, "I'll be fine, I'll be fine." I mean, that doesn't, you know, if you're living outside America, that's just almost unwatchable.
So would you say that it's changed, though, since, because I'm also, sadly, a child of American popular culture, has it changed from 1980s Syria? Like, what is it? Because it's not like American culture, popular culture, has become more inward-looking than it was then.
It's always been inward-looking, so I'm glad you mentioned 1980s. You may remember that Rambo was dedicated to the brave Mujahideen fighters of Afghanistan. And it's only after they turned out to become Taliban that they had to change that to the brave people of Afghanistan. You know, Rambo is a great case study because Rambo is about the American civilizing mission just all over Asia. You know, he civilizes the weaklings of Vietnam and then Afghanistan. And Rocky, you know, I mean, in those days, the villains used to be Russians, at least. I mean, that may come back. That may come back. But even down to the bad guy boxer, they were Russians. So no, I don't think it's changed. I just think we have so many more options now. We have access to so much more that we don't have to watch that. We can choose to watch other things. And that's certainly the case for many people that I know who are living in Pakistan or living in Asia. They're just watching other products.
Well, one of the points that you make about the spread of American popular culture then and now, you write, quote, "American culture was spread not just through the power of its inherent coolness, but also by the American defense complex." So to the extent that military power, if not occupation, is critical to the spread of culture across national boundaries, does that play at all in the cultures that you're talking about that are now being exported extremely successfully and being consumed all over the world of Korea, India, and Turkey?
Well, just to give you some background on that, you know, 1968 was the peak of American deployment of military personnel. And at that point, there were over 1 million American military personnel deployed all over the world. I think it's something like 54 countries. So that's not only a huge amount of people, but those people were supported by the machinery of bases. They brought in their culture, they brought in their movies, their magazines, their music, and they also needed to be entertained. So these were places for culture to be performed. So South Korea, which I write about in New Kings of the World, is in fact the best example of that. And from 1945 till 48, America ran full military government in South Korea. In the 50s, they have over 300,000 troops in South Korea alone. And at that time, if you were a young South Korean, your options were pretty limited music-wise. Because of the Japanese invasion and settlement before the Americans, the most popular music at that time was something called trot. And that was a mix of foxtrot and Japanese choral music, essentially. So that's like your parents' music, right. You know, your grandparents' music even. And if you wanted to listen to something besides trot, there was really only one place to go, the American bases. And if you were a musical performer of some kind and you wanted to play rock and roll, the only place you could go were the bases. And in fact, today, even though the full military government has ended of South Korea, there are more American military personnel deployed there than in Iraq and Afghanistan combined. I think in terms of the new cultures that I write about, that's certainly something that we're going to see in the next few years. You know, Turkey is a great example. They're pushing out Turkish power into the world in a very systematized way. And that will potentially include Turkish bases as well. Will they then use their bases as a springboard for Turkish culture? They may. They also don't really have to, because Turkish culture is springing quite well on its own at the moment.
And what about for India?
I think India's a difficult case because of what's happening in India today. India's hard to tell. I think the Indian influence is very wide, not just because of Indian power, but also because of Indian migrants. I think they're the second largest migrants in the world, And for example, the reason you have great Bollywood fans in places like Uganda or Nigeria or Kenya are because there have been Indians settled there for a long time, and they bring their culture with them. How politics will complicate that, I think, again, is an interesting thing to watch in the very near future.
So let's talk about the Badshah, the king of Bollywood, who you profile and you spend all this time with in Dubai and in Abu Dhabi?
Yes, yeah. Dubai and Abu Dhabi.
While he's filming. So I'm sure almost everyone here is familiar with who he is, but if you could say a little bit about the time that you spent with him, and what you think accounts for his near universal appeal. I mean, he is now apparently the most popular, or has been, the most popular actor in the world. And just to echo some of what you wrote in the book, a Guardian reporter who profiled him said that she was struck that, quote, the hysteria that follows him makes Beatlemania look like a library's convention. I thought, wow.
Is that Nosheen Iqbal?
I can't remember the author's name.
She did a good profile of him too. We can't really see you, but is there anyone here who hasn't heard of Shah Rukh Khan? One person?
Yeah.
I'm sure that's not true. There's always a contrarian somewhere. But, okay, so one person is still a low number.
Yes.
Shah Rukh comes from an interesting background, and his background is unusual for Bollywood. Shah Rukh is the son of a freedom fighter who fought against British colonialism. Shah Rukh's father's family and Shah Rukh's father come from Peshawar originally. Their family house is still there in Peshawar. And he worked with Abdul Ghaffar Khan, known, of course, as Frontier Gandhi. And his father was a poet. Shah Rukh himself is interested in literature. I mean, all that's already incredibly unique. And he comes of age just as India undergoes neoliberal reforms. That's when actually all three of the Khans, Amir, Salman, and Shah Rukh, break out. They all break out at the same time. But unlike Amir and Salman, Shah Rukh breaks out in an unconventional way. So his early films, he doesn't play the characters we know him for today, the sort of lovable boy next door. He plays psychopaths. He plays stalkers and, I mean, really creepy sort of characters. And yet people love it, and people love him. And Shah Rukh embodies a moment in India of great change and great hope and great possibility. And he's adopted, I think, by all of South Asia at this time. He's, of course, a Muslim. All the three Khans are Muslims. I mean, the three biggest actors in Bollywood today, as 10 years ago, as in the 90s, are all members of a minority. And he encapsulates something hopeful. I think that's partly what accounts for his stratospheric success.
And he also moved from television to film,
yes,
right? Which is a very unusual.
He's also, yeah, exactly. He's one of the few people who moved from TV to film successfully. And one of the nice little known facts about Shah Rukh is that Arundhati Roy, the famous Indian writer, wrote a film. And Shah Rukh had a tiny little part in that film.
Annie.
Yeah,
like that, yeah.
I've forgotten it. What is Annie? Yeah. Annie get your gun.
Gun or something.
Yes, Annie gives it those ones. That's right.
Yeah, that's it.
And he has a small role in that film, and he goes from strength to strength to strength to strength. I mean, he's still making movies. He's still the hero of his films, and he hasn't really slowed down in any way.
And what about the time that you, I mean, as a character, you spent a lot of time with him, or several days? How long was it?
It was 2 days, actually. 2 days. I was given the choice. At that time, Shah Rukh was going to go and record a TED Talk in Canada. So I was asked by his team that, do you want to come and see the TED Talk? Or he's going to be shooting for an Egyptian prank show for an Arab channel in Dubai and Abu Dhabi. So that was obviously the one that I chose. And I spent a bit of time with him before the shooting, interviewing him, and then spent the day with him as we traveled to Abu Dhabi. And it was a sort of planes, trains, and automobiles. You know, there was helicopters and cars and all this sort of stuff. And, I mean, I don't want to ruin... Okay, you may have seen a clip maybe 2 years ago of Shah Rukh Khan in a jeep being drowned in a swamp. and then a lizard comes out to eat him. Does this ring a bell? So that's what I went to watch. It was, I mean, it was crazy, obviously. Obviously, because the world of TV and film is so bizarre anyways.
Yeah.
I mean, now throw a lizard and a swamp and all this other stuff into it.
And Shah Rukh.
And Shah Rukh Khan, and it becomes even stranger.
Right.
But it was, I remember that the producer and the people around the shows kept saying to me that, we don't think of Shah Rukh as an Indian star. Shah Rukh is an international star. And, Egyptian, Indian, same thing. He's one of ours. We understand him. He speaks to us.
I mean, that's one of the extraordinary things. He is an international star. You mentioned it in your book, and of course it was in the news here when it happened, and it's happened more than once, that he was stopped at immigration coming into the U.S. And it was such a big deal that someone in the State Department had to
apologize. That's right. I think he was stopped 3 times. He was stopped 3 times. I mean, that must be the only person actually in the world who didn't know who Shah Rukh Khan was.
But it couldn't have been the same person.
Well, he must have had a cousin or something. And I think that too is part of his allure to the world. That here is this incredibly well-known person, this respected person, and he struggles as much as your everyman. I mean, Shah Rukh speaks to the everyman. I think that's his appeal.
And I think it was following one of those incidents, the film, which is shown in the video that you talked about, My Name is Khan, came out in part from that incident, right? Because it's all about this guy who people think is a terrorist.
Yeah.
And
I mean, it's
in the US.
Yeah, it's one of his rare political films. And at its time, it was a brave film. It was a film about a man who has Asperger's and who has migrated to America, and he has a stepson, and his stepson is killed by bullies in his American school after 9/11 because of his name, because they hear his name and assume he's Muslim, and that therefore he must be a terrorist. And so Shah Rukh Khan's character walks across, in a very Forrest Gumpian way, across the United States of America to tell everybody in the country that his name is Khan and he is not a terrorist. I don't know if you could make a film like that in Bollywood today. I'm not sure.
Well, so let's talk about that. Which you mentioned, you read about in the pieces that you read right now from the book, and you also talk about in the book, which is the transformation of Hindi. I mean, it was called Hindi cinema once. It was not always Bollywood. It became Bollywood only after India liberalized, and it was exported as a commodity. That the transformation, it went from being kind of chaste and conservative and modest and representing, the angry young man, which was typified by Amitabh Bachchan, as we know. And then it's become now this extremely garish and, as you said, pornographic displays of wealth and consumption and Prada and Gucci and so on. And yet, and of course, explicit, vulgar displays of, drugs, sex. This was all completely verboten in previous Hindi cinema. So, despite that, though, despite the fact that the cinema so clearly doesn't represent the dispossessed anymore, as you show in your writing, and as you just spoke about now, the indigenous people in Peru still somehow find some resonance in this film. Now, race is one aspect of it, but is that what you think explains it all over? All over the world? All over the world. I mean, the sense that it actually now, what Bollywood represents is, in effect, the 1%. It's no one else. Yeah,
I mean, it's true that the films of Bollywood are such a great mirror for Indian society and Indian politics for any moment. The films of the Raj Kapoor films of the 1950s are really about a hopeful, idealistic nationalism that's one of brotherhood, one of striving towards justice where justice is attainable. And, the heroes of that era of the 1950s films are not billionaires or industrialists. They're poor men, but they're men with a great idealism for the path ahead. And they are socialist in spirit. And even the angry young man, Amitabh Bachchan's characters were still socialist in spirit, but they were angry. They were furious now at a system that continually keeps them down. And there was something really beautiful about those films because of that, because they were films that tried to capture the invisible and the unseen members of society. and the great stories of friendship and so on. And again, the heroes of Amitabh Bachchan's films of the 70s were at home in the village. They were at home in the village, at home in the city. They were men who were able to move between the two. And then by the 1990s, that all changes. Now there's no more village, and if the village is there, it's nostalgic and it's very stylized. And but the hero of the 1990s films is not a farmer. He's the guy who goes to Spain to find his father. He's the guy who takes the Mediterranean cruise, with all his closest friends. Right. In Kabhi Khushi Kabhi Gham, they don't even use cars; they just use helicopters. So it's this kind of absurd materialism, and now, of course, they're very propagandistic. A lot of the films today are very jingoistic and reflect this kind of rightward tilt. But I'm hopeful, at least, that there are some exceptions. So Gully Boy, I think, is a great exception, and I think Gully Boy is really the best film to come out that I've seen in 100%. The past few years, because it recalls old Bollywood. Because this is about, for those of you who haven't seen it yet, it's on Amazon Prime, so you can. And it's India's submission to the Oscars, I believe. It's about a young Muslim boy who lives in a slum.
In Dharavi, in fact, the biggest slum.
That's right, in Bombay, who wants to become a rapper. And there are these great scenes in the film where he's employed as the driver of this rich family's car, and he's got to drive this daughter around to, all her rave parties and dinners, and at one point he's sitting in the car just endlessly waiting for the girl to come to be done, and he hears music, and because he's a musician and an aspiring musician, he's sort of entranced by the music, and he gets out of the car and he follows the music, and he's almost followed it to the door. And at that moment where he's about to step into the threshold, the bouncer, the chokidar of the rave, is standing there, and they catch each other's eyes, and the chokidar just does. And that was so powerful. I haven't seen that in a film in a long time. So I think I'm cautious about saying it's over and that it's just going to be Hollywood excess and Hollywood materialism. It is true that it's more racy than ever before. It is true that they are adapting things. So even Gully Boy, you might have noticed, had a lot of songs, but no dancing.
You're right.
So there's no backup dancers, there's no fountain, there's no, snow in Kashmir, there's none of that. And I think that's because they're looking a little westward. The question is, will they make films like Gully Boy, or will they make films like Uri? That's the question.
I mean, that's with Gully Boy, in fact, right after that moment, and that's why it had this echo of Amitabh and the angry young man, because right after the moment that you describe, he comes back and he's extremely angry.
Exactly.
And he sits in the car and he says, "Apna time aayega."
Yeah, exactly.
My time will come.
Exactly.
But so that's the thing. What that film did, it's true that now there is no longer a village, as you said, but there is now a large urban proletariat. And the films now in Bollywood, even so-called independent cinema, they are not preoccupied with the concerns of, so that now when people watch Bollywood, there's this impression that in fact all of India must be middle class, if not upper middle class. But what happened to all the people who came from villages to urban areas, and where is their representation?
Unseen. And that's one of the things that is troubling. Obviously, globalization as we know it has been exposed as a lie, because it promised the world that there was going to be this onslaught of opportunity and wealth and access. You just had to work for it. And millions of people, so over 1 billion people have migrated. We live at a time of the peak of migration that we've ever known. And in countries like America and in Europe, the impression is that they're all coming here. But actually, out of 1 billion people, only about 200 million people are leaving their countries for other countries. The majority, some 700-something million people, are moving within their own countries. I heard something incredible the other day that within a decade, half of the world's population is going to be middle class, and 2/3 of that is going to come from Asia. But those people are not reflected in Bollywood. They are. Some of them are reflected in Turkish shows, though. Turkey has been skillful in telling those stories and in not ignoring the dispossessed, the disenfranchised, the uncomfortable. Bollywood has, and Rachel Dwyer, who's an academic who studies Bollywood and film, makes a really interesting observation in a book that she wrote, I think, 10 years ago. She says in the older films, the household staff were a part of the story. There might be a sort of ayah or a cook or a domestic staff who's a part of the story in a powerful way. And she says you don't even see them in the films of today. They're just tucked away in the kitchen. They don't even have names or personalities or storylines.
Well, I mean, so we'll get to the Dizi, the form in Turkey that's now all over the world. But one other aspect of this, the change that took place in Hindi cinema or Bollywood after India liberalized, which is that, and you cite Pankaj Mishra as saying that Bollywood created the mood music for Modi. So what is the link that you see between the kind of India that's represented in Bollywood and the rise of a right-wing government, and which is increasingly belligerent, exclusive, exclusionary, etc.?
Well, it's really a distinctly aggressive, a cultural aggressiveness in a way. And the example that I give is Kabhi Khushi Kabhie Gham. Again, and there's a scene in that film which, if we put it on today, you might have a bit of a giggle. It's that scene where Shah Rukh's son stands up in his English countryside public school, and he sings the Indian national anthem. And as he's singing it, somehow all these white English kids know the words and they stand up and start singing it. And then everyone in the audience, Shah Rukh stands up, the wife stands up, and then all these English aristocrats stand up. And the best part is there's a girl in a wheelchair. She can't stand up, so she raises her arms, because she wants to be a part. So, okay, we can watch this and sort of say, oh, it's funny, or, it's kitsch or whatever. But it has a political consequence. And the political consequence is that when that film was in the cinemas in India, a man in a Bhopal cinema was watching that film and was so moved by that scene that he actually did stand up in his cinema seat. And when he stood up, all the people behind him got annoyed and said, sit down and get out of our way and, shut up. And he was so offended that he left and he began a protest outside the Bhopal cinema. And when that protest didn't go anywhere, he filed public litigation and he took a case all the way to the Supreme Court to make it mandatory for people to stand for the Indian national anthem. Now, it was mandatory. That law was tweaked last year, so in 2018 they made it optional again. But these are films with political consequence, The NRI films of Karan Johar feed into a lot of this narrative. Again, in God, they all have K names. I never understood why, except that his name starts with a K.
Kabhi Alvida Na Kehna.
No, not that one. Oh, Kuch Kuch Hota Hai. There's a lot of distinctly jingoistic, they raise the flag every morning. And what is interesting, actually, is that I think Indian films always had that. Indians are very nationalistic people. They're people who are very proud of their country. As are Turks. Turks are also very nationalistic people, very proud of their country. But you don't see Turkish flags in Dizi. Nobody salutes the flag. Nobody wears a pin with the flag. There's no Turkish equivalent of Jai Hind in the Dizi. And all that comes. But at the same time, I think Modi has been, whether it's the modification of Bollywood or the other way around is unclear. But after Pakistan and India faced off in February, and anytime two nuclear countries face off, that's a terrifying thing. Our air forces were engaged in dogfights for the first time since 1971. And that was in February. And as Modi was campaigning during the elections, which took place in May in India, he said repeatedly that what happened with Pakistan in February was just a trailer. The full movie is to come. So there's a lot of this sort of crossover. And, just look at the films that are coming out today. They're, Leni Riefenstahl would be embarrassed. You know, the director of Devdas announced on Modi's birthday that he is going to make a film on Modi. I'm embarrassed for him, you know, at least announced it the day after.
Right.
You know, not to be so obvious.
But it's also the other connection. It's true, Karan Johar has a big part to play in this, but it's also, and again, one doesn't know which comes first, but that...
I think they rise together.
And that NRIs have become, in this country, one could say especially, extremely conservative and sympathetic to this Hindutva type ideology. I mean, there was just very recently that extremely embarrassing spectacle, Modi.
I know, it's hard to pronounce it, isn't it? Because you don't know where
Modi,
Yeah. It was
in Houston.
It was chilling in a way to watch. Also, I was struggling to think of another world leader who wants to be on a stage with Trump for 45 minutes. I couldn't really think of any, except maybe Bolsonaro. But you know, it's so interesting the way pop culture has invaded all our lives and politics. And I've never thought pop culture is frivolous. I've always thought it's important to watch and we should be suspicious of it. And those of you who watched the Pakistani Prime Minister's speech at the UN will also remember that he talked about pop culture. Prime Minister Khan, in fact, referenced the great classic film Death Wish at the UN. Did you catch that?
No.
Yes.
What is Death Wish? I don't even know.
Death Wish, the Charles Bronson film.
Oh, I see,
Death Wish.
right. I thought you were translating from some Bollywood
Oh, no,
film.
it's not like a Hindi film.
Okay.
It's an American film, and he quoted Death Wish. I mean, I've never heard of a leader at the UN referencing Death Wish. But it's, and he said, you know, we've grown up with Western movies of the good guy who can take it no longer. That's exactly what he said. I think that's fascinating. And also, by the way, at the UN, Prime Minister Khan spoke about an initiative, a television initiative. Did you see that? Where Malaysia, Pakistan, and Turkey are going to come together to launch a new TV channel. One aimed at countering Islamophobia and presenting a different face of the Islamic world. So pop culture is not silly at all. It's very serious stuff, and countries are thinking about it seriously. The problem is we're watching it innocently, thinking, oh, it's just entertainment. It's not entertainment. You have to watch it with that discerning part of your brain that's asking, who is exactly delivering this message to me?
I mean, one of the things that I was very surprised by is that you say in the book about Turkey that it's second only to America in television distribution all over the world. And that's thanks in large part to the genre that you talk about, Dizi. So explain what Dizi is, first of all, for people who don't know, and why it can't be called a soap opera.
So Dizi is what the Turks call their television shows. They cannot call them soap operas because they are a distinct genre. They are distinct in score. They have unique scores. They are distinct in the production. So each episode of a Dizi is about 2 hours and 15 minutes long. They can go into, you know, they can be 20 episodes or they can be 300 episodes. They can have as little as 5 cast members to 200 cast members. They range between epics set in the Ottoman era to modern dramas set in our present day. They abide by certain rules. A scriptwriter in Istanbul put them to me quite succinctly. And one of them was that the hero of a Dizi will never hold a gun. That they're not very violent. I mean, okay, the ones about Ottoman conquest certainly will have war, etc. But it will never be the hero who is the man killing or the man employing violence. They're very conservative. They're in terms of romantic storylines. Oh gosh, some of you have seen Dizi? Liars. They're on Netflix. You can see them on Amazon Prime. You can. It's difficult to get them on YouTube because Turkey geo-blocks them. They don't want people to watch them on YouTube. But they're very popular. And just to give you a scale, so if there's anyone here who grew up in India or Pakistan, you might remember watching The Bold and the Beautiful on Star Plus or Star TV in the 1990s. Yes? Anyone? Okay. The Bold and the Beautiful, which of course is an American soap opera, at its peak had been watched by a global audience of 26 million people. But Magnificent Century, the Turkish Dizi about Sultan Süleyman the Magnificent, at its peak has been watched by upwards of 500 million people.
It's amazing.
So the only part of the world that the Turks haven't invaded with television is the English-speaking world.
Which explains why no one here has watched Dizi.
Here, but they're big in South America, they're big in Eastern Europe, they're now getting into Western Europe, they're huge in Asia.
Well, the people that you spoke to, why is it that they haven't come into the English-speaking world? It's odd.
Yeah, so when I asked people in Istanbul, they had a couple of theories. One, they said, that English speakers don't like to read subtitles. They'll read subtitles for a film, but they're not going to read subtitles for 2 hours every night of the week. That there's a discomfort there. And the second theory they had is because they're uncomfortable with the fact that these are cultural products coming out of the Muslim world. And I interviewed the head of the studio that made Magnificent Century and that makes a lot of the big shows. And he said, they shouldn't think of it like that. They should remember that we used to be the superpower of that era. We were the superpower of the world. We used to be what America is today. And if they think about it that way, then they should be more comfortable. But I think that would only make people more uncomfortable, actually.
But also the appeal. I mean, one of the things that an actor tells you, whom you speak to for the book, is that the appeal of this genre, he says that while American television is entertaining, it's not moving. He says, quote, it doesn't touch the feelings that make us human. Yeah. So from what you understand of its appeal, the people who you spoke to, it's very popular, of course, in Pakistan, not only in Pakistan, but also in Pakistan. Why does it resonate in a way that other television from elsewhere does not? I mean, including, in fact, Pakistani television. And speak in particular, this thing, what you talked about earlier, the role of, let's say, the domestic
yes.
within
Yes.
how they're not, in fact, erased from the
That's right.
story.
So the actor who told me that is the actor Halit Ergenç, who plays Sultan Süleyman in Magnificent Century. And he also said that Turkish Dizi essentially have followed the path of Ottoman expansion. It stops at Vienna. It goes up until that point and then has a pause. And
funny.
Also, when I met him in Istanbul, he sang Jive Jive Pakistan to me, which was a bit shocking. And he said, I grew up singing it. We always celebrate Pakistani national holidays. And that was interesting. That was something I didn't expect, to be honest. But yes, the Turkish shows are interesting because they are about Ottoman kings and Ottoman queens and the rulers of dominions. But they are also about the poor. They're also about the struggling. The domestic staff in the shows are not invisible. They are sometimes the central character with their own agency, with their own voice. Their storyline is separate. It's not told through the eyes of the madam, let's say. And an interesting story is one that comes from an older show called Aşk-ı Memnu or Forbidden Love. And in this show, there's a widower, and he has several children, and he has a governess who looks after his children. And the governess is sort of in love with her employer. And the screenwriter, Ece Yürenç, who's a quite phenomenal woman. I mean, she's one of the stars of Turkish television, and she makes sure to write empowered women in her shows, told me that the rights for the show were bought by an Indian channel. They showed it in India, but they wanted to make an Indian version of it. And the Indian screenwriter said to her, listen, we can't have a governess in love with her employer here. So can we make her his cousin? And she went, no, you can't. So eventually they made her the dead wife's friend. But that's a fascinating anecdote. I mean, it's so revealing. The other one that I always mention, and there are many more shows that speak to this. There are many more current shows. But for this book, I was looking at a few of the new shows, but really at the big ones that are responsible for this massive popularity. The other one, of course, is a show essentially called What is Fatma Gul's Fault? And this is the story of a young girl from a coastal town who's an orphan. She lives with her uncle or her brother and his wife, who are bakers. And she suffers a gang rape inflicted by the son of wealthy industrialist boys from Istanbul. I mean, you're not seeing that kind of thing in Bollywood anymore, you know?
Definitely
The
not.
industrialist son is the hero, not the villain.
Right.
And in Turkey, you don't see that.
And also the fact that Dizi, they're not, you don't read subtitles, they're dubbed in Urdu, and then also speak about the Arabic, the Syrian Arabic.
Yes, so if you watch a Turkish Dizi on Netflix this evening, as I know you will, they will be subtitled. But if you are watching a Turkish Dizi in Chile, it will be in Spanish. And if you are watching a Turkish Dizi in Karachi, it's going to be in Urdu. And part of its popularity, part of the way in which they traveled the world, is that they were bought by a Middle Eastern channel first. And the man who bought it, who I interviewed for New Kings, had a sort of flash decision. He decided two things. The first is that they were going to rename them in Arabic. They were going to rename the shows, and they were going to rename all the characters, which, I mean, didn't happen in Pakistan. In Pakistan, they have the same names. But in the Arabic version, so in Forbidden Love, they changed their names. And his second decision was that he was going to dub it in the Syrian Arabic dialect. And that accounts for a lot of its popularity. Because, of course, there is a modern standard Arabic, which is the Arabic you hear on the news, but then every country has their own particular dialect. And the Syrian dialect has always been considered the most beautiful. The most beautiful, the most poetic. And Syria, of course, before the war, had a big theater community. The government put a lot of money into television. They allowed TV shows to film in historic sites. You have a lot of university graduates in Syria who graduated in theater studies and acting. And one of the things that happens is that, let's say the actor who plays character X in a Turkish show will be called Adnan. That same voice actor will play that actor in every show he does, hence, and they will always call him Adnan. Right? So people grew very attached. And it really kicked off there. And it was from there that it traveled to the world.
And you tell this I don't know if you want to read from it or just talk about it. You go to the refugee camp in Lebanon, where there's Syrian refugees who are watching this film. I'm not sure, Rachel, how are we for time?
We're okay.
We can read?
We could do Q&A in about 10 minutes.
Okay, that's great.
I'll
why don't you read a little?
Just to preface this, what I did for New Kings is I went to see where the culture is produced and then where it is consumed. So that's why I went to Peru. And for Turkey, I went to Lebanon because the Lebanese, of course, were an Ottoman colony. And they were an especially bitter colony because the Lebanese think that they're the first people of the universe. They consider themselves completely distinct from the rest of the Arab world. And they consider themselves the cultural hub. And what I found, which was interesting, is that they're still pretty bitter about Turkish hegemony and Turkish history, but the moment you ask them what TV show they're watching, they completely forget. And then they say, well, but at the end of the day, we're all Asians, or, at the end of the day, this is our culture too. And one of the things that I wanted to do, because I grew up in Syria, is I wanted to include Syria somehow, and it wasn't safe to travel to Syria, so I went to a refugee camp and spoke to the people there. And I will say in the beginning, it was sort of embarrassing to turn up in a refugee camp and say, so, sorry, what are you watching on TV? But it reveals a lot, actually, about the experience of being displaced, and that's what I'm going to read from here. In Akkar, 2 floor fans have been switched on, blowing a gentle breeze of warm air against Sheikh Abdo, the camp's community leader's home. For the young and the old, these shows are linked to our past, he explains, drawing an elegant super slim cigarette out of its pack and lighting it. They are a reminder of what the refugees once had the good fortune to experience before fate brought them here, to this converted garbage dump, now camp. Family, love, bonds of brotherhood, and friendship. Khadija, a mother of 7, clad in a long, regal, purple kaftan, has been in Al-Ihsan for 5 years. She and her family had left the home she ever knew, Homs, and were shuttled across 4 cities by the Red Cross before being settled in Akkar. Her husband worked in construction in Syria, but was unemployed here, even though there's so much building that needs to be done. Her 5 sons live in constant fear of being picked up by the Lebanese army. They don't have the right papers and are illegal in Lebanon. When they try to work, they get caught and get arrested. The Lebanese army and police eventually let them go, Khadija said, but it scares the women so much. The men get sick in jail. It's filthy there, so unhygienic. And the women, they get sick after, from mental illness. When we spoke, out on the dirt road, a bus with a white decal of Jesus in profile on its back window, wearing a crown of thorns and a tear in his eye, drove by. As it ground past the narrow space between the camp and the world, a cloud of dust lifted up from the earth. Jesus save you, the decal said to no one in particular. I watch all the shows, Khadija told me emphatically, pressing her hands on my knees as we sat together on thinly stuffed, misshapen cushions. I watch them for the stories. Love, defending each other. That's what I like. Her long hair was tied back in a bun and her face glowed as she spoke about the Dizi. It takes me away from here. I'm living in war and all I want to watch is romance. Sheikh Abdo must be in his early 40s. He's too young to be called Sheikh, but was given the honorific in appreciation of everything he's done for the displaced in the Al-Ihsan camp. He inhales deeply from his slender cigarette, running a hand across his white stubble as he does so. All of them watch the TV shows here too. There's nothing at night to do except watch television. This small community of Syrian refugees has been in Lebanon since the start of the Syrian war, Sheikh Abdo says sadly, and they'll stay here until there's a solution. The roof over our head is made of thin, silvery sheeting, and the home is bare except for one luxury item, a fridge, which hums audibly in the corner as we speak. Sheikh Abdo is not exactly a fan of Turkish television programs. He insists on making this clear to me. All that tension, it's too much. Sheikh Abdo says dismissively, too much gossip and too much intrigue and too much suspense. Who can tolerate 2 hours of that every night? He was a teacher and a social worker before the war, and it's purely in this anthropological regard that he might join his fellow exiles in watching an episode or two. In the early days of the war, people were obsessed with the news in the camps. At 4 a.m. sometimes, Sheikh Abdo would walk outside his brick and silver sheet home and see young men, teenagers, kids even, outside on the dirt roads, pacing up and down in the dark, scouring their mobiles for news of home. They'd tell me so-and-so killed so-and-so, this guy blew himself up, they're 10 years old, but they know what's happening in Halab, which is the Arabic name for Homs. They knew who was a shaheed and who was alive, still fighting. It's less intense now, he shrugs, exhaling a thin plume of smoke. Some of those youngsters have figured out that the news is nothing but lies. 7 years of war have taught the refugees that there's no hope to be found in breaking news. Put on the shows, the same boys say now, Sheikh Abdo recounts. Let's remember home. Let's remember Syria. But he doesn't join them, he reminds me. I don't want to watch the shows, he says. It's not home. It's Turkey. But it's better than the news? I ask. Sheikh Abdo's phone lights up with a WhatsApp call. It's been buzzing since we sat down. He glances at the screen for a moment, his brow furrowing, before he looks at me. Of course, he replies, but it's still stress. And by the way, what I was saying earlier about the fact that the world is becoming middle class and that 2/3 of that will be in Asia, the definition of becoming middle class is the ability to buy a fridge.
Wow.
That's what makes you middle class.
Wow. I mean, that story, when I read it, a few years ago, Democracy Now!, we went to Calais, which at the time had the largest refugee camp in all of Europe, Calais, France. And there's only one little cafe there. There was. Now the camp has been dismantled, which I don't know if any of you saw. There was a play at St. Anne's Warehouse called The Jungle. Was it St. Anne? Right. So that the play centers on this cafe. So there's only this one cafe. And so when we were filming, we were there all day. It was freezing cold. I mean, not that we should complain, whatever. It was terrible for the people who live there. We went into this one cafe, and there's a giant television in the corner mounted on this makeshift wall, and non-stop Bollywood songs. Well, it was extraordinary.
You know, Khadija, who I just spoke about right now, she loved Dizi, but she told me, she said, you know, my husband, he's such a pain, I can't get him away from the Bollywood. He watches it non-stop. And she said, and she took a sheet from the floor and she pulled it over herself like a sari and said, here, this is Bollywood, watch me now. Which I thought was sweet.
Okay, so but before we open it up to the audience, I want you to say a little bit, at least, about K-pop, yes. Korean pop. Yeah. What it is, yeah. Why it's so popular now. Yeah.
So K-pop, I mean, is a massive phenomena, and it really is born quite interestingly. It has two sort of genesis points. The first is out of the bases. So one of the earliest K-pop groups, you could call it that at least, were a trio called the Kim Sisters. And, you know, they appeared with Dean Martin in the 1950s. They came on the Ed Sullivan Show in this country something like 20 times. And they were discovered performing on the basses. So part of it has its genesis from there. And the more recent genesis comes from the Asian financial crisis. So in 1997, when Asia was wrecked, Korea was hit especially badly. And at that time, they had to take out what was then the largest ever bailout from the IMF. So in Korea, it's not the Asian financial crisis, it's the IMF crisis. And as they were struggling to rebuild their economy, it was very clear to them that they couldn't rebuild in the same way, relying on Hyundai and Samsung, you know, these monster kind of companies to see them through the recovery. And President Kim Dae-jung was inspired by Andrew Lloyd Webber and his musicals and Hollywood. And he was incredibly insightful and perceptive because he understood that pop culture required no organizational infrastructure. So you just needed talent and you needed time. So as early as the late 90s, Korea starts to lay the country with broadband internet. By 2015, the internet connections in Korea are 200 times faster than the average American internet connection. And they put a lot of money into the cultural industries and a lot of training. So they issue these manuals on how to export culture with little factoids, like if you're going to the Muslim world, don't put a television show on during prayer time, things like that. And what's happened actually is an explosion of Korean culture. They're huge in video games. They're huge in television dramas. They make very sophisticated high culture films. And then there's K-pop, which is a $5 billion a year industry. And what's interesting to know about K-pop is that it relies on something called globalization, which is taking global and making it local. So they take Western pop music, Western tempo, and they speed it up. And it's that speeding up that makes it dancey, that makes it positive and energetic sounding. And it's like Dizi, like Bollywood, it's very it's traditional and modern. So a K-pop video looks really slick and it's high production value. But the song lyrics are really, really, really sweet and unoffensive and adorable. I mean, I can read you some, in fact, because I'll never remember them offhand. I've got it in a footnote. Hang on. I mean, I know you're going to pretend, oh, I've never heard K-pop, but I know you all probably listen to it too. 1 second.
And it's also like a group. I was surprised that there are like 20 people in a group or 15 people in every band or something like that.
Oh, yeah. They're massive. Hang on. I'm just going to find, where is it? Okay, I'll find it during the questions and I'll read it to you. But they're very wholesome lyrics. They're not racy or suggestive. You don't need to beep out bad words in K-pop. There are no bad words. And they're put through an industrial factory system. So it's not an accident that a band makes it big. It's a strategic vision that makes them big. So before you've ever heard of a K-pop star, that star or that group or that band has been through 3 to 5 years of training, and hundreds of thousands of dollars have been spent teaching them how to sing, how to dance, how to speak, how to stand, how to sit, how to eat, how to walk. They've had to undergo plastic surgery, and then yes, they have. Part of the reason they have so many people in a band comes from the Japanese, because the Japanese taught Koreans choral music when they were there. So they organized them into choruses, basically, and into choirs to sing. And so you'll have like 12 people in a K-pop band, and like one is the funny one is the sporty one is the laughing one is the sad one is the happy one is the, like, it's something for everyone. And then they have subunits. So you'll have the Korean unit, which is, let's say, the main unit. So there's a Korean band called EXO, and they have EXO-M, which is for Mandarin. And there'll be an entirely new set of people that sing in Mandarin. And then you might have the J subunit for Japan, and they will sing in Japan and wear Japanese clothes and all the rest. And there's a band called NCT that was here in America recently, and they are a terrifying concept. Billboard called them more of an idea than a band, because they're going to have limitless subunits. So they will have the Seoul subunit, the LA subunit, the New York subunit, the Hong Kong subunit, every kind of subunit. And it's designed for the market.
It's like a franchise.
It's like Burger King.
Right.
Oh, here, hold on, I found the lyrics. Okay. Mm-hmm. So when I was writing this book, I had a bunch of sheets. So I had an Excel sheet for all of Shah Rukh Khan's films. You know, how many films does he cry in? He cries in all the films. Wow. And I asked him, I said, why do you cry in all your films? And he said, I've never cried in a film. Really? And then I had synopses of the Turkish Dizi, and then I wrote down song lyrics. And it's, oh, by the way, sorry, one more thing. Part of the strategy is that Korean is a syllabic language, unlike Japanese or unlike Mandarin, and very much like English. That's why when you hear a Korean song, you can sing along with it, even though you don't know what they're saying. But what they do strategically is they always place a few English words. So there's something for you to hold on to and repeat at the top of your voice. And so I wrote down some of the English words. So there's a song called Dinosaur, and the English lyrics are dinosaur, oh, dinosaur. That's the English. And then G-Dragon has a song called Crayon. I mean, do you see how wholesome this is? Dragon, crayon. And the English words in crayon were swag, black, crack. Get your crayon. Get your crayon. Get your crayon.
Right. So I think now we'll open it up to the audience for questions. Just a couple of things. If you could please briefly just say your name before you ask a question, and also kindly frame your statement as a question. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Nomi. I'm a librarian. So I look at the pattern of reading, what people choose to read. And Mark Twain once said that once we know your religious identity, we know what books you read and what books you avoid. Same is true about political identity. Once we know your political affiliation, we know what newspapers you read and what newspapers you avoid. And I was wondering if the same pattern is at work when we choose the media for, like, you know, tribalism is on the rise. The West is becoming more and more tribal. And we see in the East, perhaps there is some diversification in the media that we are choosing. So is it still tribalism, narcissism at work?
I think you have a little bit of everything at work. There is some of it at play and some of it not at play. So in the case of Turkey, in the case of Dizi, they are almost designed to be global. So the actors of a Turkish show look like us. Mm-hmm. They look dark-haired, light-haired, dark-skinned, light-skinned. The cityscape could be any city. It doesn't identify it as Turkish. That's part of what I said earlier. There's no flag. There's no poster of Ataturk. So if you've ever been to Turkey, you will know that everywhere there are posters of Ataturk, the father of modern Turkey. He's on billboards, he's on lapels, but not in the Dizi. In the Dizi, when you're watching a show, it could be London, it could be Istanbul, it could be New York. It's pretty unclear. So I think that's
so they don't show any iconic.
They might show some iconic neighborhoods or some some beautiful the old Ottoman mansions on the Bosphorus sometimes will show up. But what you really see is the home, the street in front of the home, the coffee shop. There's nothing that says this is a Muslim country or this is an Asian country. Another thing that they don't do is they don't have women in hijab in the Turkish shows. Now, of course, if you're in Istanbul or anywhere in Turkey, there are many women who wear the veil. They're not shown in the shows. And I thought that was part of this sort of Kemalist antagonism. But it was explained to me that actually even conservative people don't like to see women in veils in Dizi, because if she's in a Dizi, she's going to be doing something sort of, like running away from home or disobeying her father, and they don't want any of that. So they're quite good at avoiding that kind of tribalism. Okay, now the second part is it's not necessarily true if you're watching the Ottoman epics, because those are obviously affiliated to a place and a time, and you've got to pick one side of the battle, so it's a little bit present there. But I think they're very nuanced at how they do it. And again, the same director and studio head who said to me, why don't they think of us as the superpower of that era? They allowed me onto a set, which was a military drama. So that was the one thing I saw that did have a bit of flags in the background, and you know sort of where you are. And I asked him, I said, Magnificent Century has been bought by, Japan was the last country to buy it when I was there to show it on Japanese TV. I said, do you think a lot of countries will buy this military show of yours? Because you kind of have to be Turkish to really want to see the Turkish soldier succeed. And he said, why not? He said, I have to watch movies where they say, God bless America at the end of the war. Why can't we say, God bless Turkey? It's a fair point.
Yeah. Other questions? There we are.
Good evening, Ms. Bhutto. My name is Mariam Khan. I'm a teacher here, and I'm going to frame my question around curiosity a little bit. I read your book with Songs in Blood. It was amazing. While I was reading that, I felt like I was actually sitting in Karachi, maybe sitting at, by the sea view. Curious to ask, how come you didn't, or I'm not, I apologize if I'm just making an assumption right now, did you make a point of mentioning Pakistani dramas? Because I love the fact that you mentioned, subcontinent in a way that you did.
Yes. Yeah, hi, Mariam. I did, actually. So I did write about Pakistani dramas and about the popularity of Pakistani dramas, not just in Pakistan, but in India and in the region. It was important for me to mention Pakistani dramas because they come from an important part of our history. So, especially in the 1980s, under Zia-ul-Haq's dictatorship, it was Pakistani TV shows that offered a very sophisticated and intelligent critique of martial law. It's always been TV shows that have addressed things like feudalism, like migrant labor, and the tensions of modern life. And the remit of this book was that I had to talk about a global power. So had there been Pakistani dramas being watched in Sweden, I would have done a whole section on them. But I couldn't find the Swedish fans. So I wrote about them in the 80s, and I wrote about how it's actually under two dictators that Pakistani television actually thrives. Under Zia, it was in opposition to Zia, of course, and his rule. And it was under General Pervez Musharraf that private TV channels start to come up in Pakistan, and that's the second iteration. So the dramas that you might see today, Humsafar is on Netflix, as far as I remember. So there are also Pakistani dramas you can watch on Netflix. That comes from that era. So yeah, there is a bit there.
Thank you so much. My name's Umbreen. I just was curious about your process of writing. So how does the idea come to you? How does it develop? Can you share just a little bit about your process?
Thank you, Umbreen. This comes out of Columbia Global Reports. The publishers essentially were commissioning books on globalization, and what they were asking people to do is to study a facet of globalization, and they wanted you to do whatever you needed to do to tell that story, but it had to include more than just one spot in the world. And I've always been interested in culture. I've always been interested in the coded messages of culture. And it seemed to me like a good time to do a book about cultures coming up that are not Western, that come from, I chose Asia. My idea for the book was slightly more expanded. I had to kind of whittle it down a bit. But it was a different process than the other books that I've written. With nonfiction, you have to do a lot more research. It's not like fiction where you're just sitting by yourself thinking all day long. So it was unusual. I had to do a lot of reading. I had to do a lot of watching TV, actually. And when I was a kid, when I was in college, I used to always think the best job in the world is a film critic, because you just watch films and then talk about them and write about them. And in fact, that is so not true. It is possibly the worst job in the world, because you have to watch films and you're stuck for hours and hours. And I mean, you know, a Turkish episode is 2 hours and a quarter. So imagine how long it takes to get through a season. So I tried to divide it up into little chunks. I mean, I did reading, I read intensely, and then only after that I would start to watch, and I would give myself time to watch, and then I had to travel and interview. And so it was easy to mark up in those kind of easy ways, but normally writing is much messier and much harder. So I got a bit lucky with this one, I guess.
Hello. Oh, yes. Hi, my name is Nishan, and
Hi.
I actually liked the part of your talk where you were talking about how Bollywood shifts from this village boy next door, from the angry village boy to the materialistic corporate son. Yeah. But wouldn't you say that Bollywood is actually now, in 2000s, actually more diverse than it was before? Compared to the 80s, you had independent movies like Janabi Do Yaro, and that was pretty much it. Yeah. But now you have Ship of Theseus, Newton, and all these others. So while there is this, materialistic view, of Bollywood movies, but you also have a lot more independent Bollywood movies.
Diverse in terms of the films or the characters? Or in
terms of the films and characters, both, okay. Right? There's, there is just this Shah Rukh Khan rich boy who's always worried just about love, but there's also, village people, there's also gully boy. So what's your thoughts on that? Well,
I think Gully Boy, I like Gully Boy so much because of that, because I hadn't seen a film in a while that would place an entire story in a Muslim setting. Not only is Gully Boy himself a Muslim, I can't remember her name now, Alia Bhatt's character also
Safina.
is Safina, there you go. I thought that was unusual. Actually, where I see a lot more diversity is not necessarily in Bollywood, but in the television shows coming out of India. I think those are more interesting in terms of the talent, the people that are acting in the shows, and also in terms of the topics that they're covering. They're more taboo breaking. They're more experimental. So I would say that. I mean, I think Bollywood is interesting. Maybe Hollywood is the same, but we're watching the same 20 people essentially making films and acting in films, and it's the same kind of film. I mean, what happens also in the era of the neoliberal period is that they become upper class. The names identify them as upper class, upper caste heroes.
They're all called Rahul.
They're all called Rahul or Raj.
Rahul, Raj.
They aren't Dalits. They don't talk about the dispossession of India. They just talk about the wealth and the success of India. They're incredible capital I India films for the most part. Gully Boy to me, and I mean, I'm happy to hear others. If you've seen others that go in the face of this, please raise your hand and tell us. But I think TV is interesting at the moment coming out of India. Have you seen the TV shows? You don't like TV, you're one of those people. But I'm not saying they're the best shows I've ever seen, but I think they're doing something the films haven't done.
Mm-hmm. Other questions?
Or film recommendations?
The gentleman in the middle.
Hi, good evening. My name's Onizm Darosha. You have to excuse me. What I was thinking about when you were talking about K-pop and the wholesomeness about the music, over the years that I've lived here in America, like the rap music is very violent. Would you think promoting to like a younger generation here and really like bringing it mainstream, that kind of wholesome music, and like raising it up through the years, would it make a difference? You think it would like calm things down, I guess? I don't know if you understand what I'm saying. Kind of like alleviate the violence and...
Yeah, I don't know. I would take a different tack on that. I would say that music doesn't create violence, but it expresses a violence that people live with, and it expresses a fear and an injustice that people endure in their daily lives, and that music reflects the society around them, the violence around them, the fear that they feel, the culture. And I think there is something slightly, I call it the tyranny of positivity that's in K-pop. There is something unnatural about music that's only about happy things, that doesn't reflect, there's obviously huge problems of mental health and depression and suicide in the K-pop industry. The songs aren't really singing about that. I think things like groups like BTS are trying to talk about it, and they're trying to sort of discuss self-esteem and self-care and all that sort of stuff. But no, I'm a big fan of rap music and hip-hop, and I think it speaks so beautifully to the world we live in today. I wrote, very long ago, I had a book of poetry, and I was asked in Karachi to come and talk to school children about poetry. And I brought in rap, We read Tupac. So I take that view of it. But there is also rap in Korea, by the way. It's just, again, really...
It's dinosaur.
It's dinosaur. I think that is a rap song, in fact.
Right. At the back. Do we have one more question? One more. Last question.
Hi, my name is Aman, and I'm from India, and I aspire to be an actor and a filmmaker. You wrote so much about Shah Rukh Khan. My question is that how do you see identity of a Muslim actor in India in the coming future? I was pretty struck by one actor which I really admire, Nawazuddin Siddiqui, coming out with a movie called Manto and simultaneously playing Bal Thackeray, which, I think that now these actors have been put in a place where I think they fear so much that they have to make these choices because they're part of a construct. And I would love to know what is your, opinion about
Thank you for the question. That's a great question, and you're right. And when Nawazuddin Siddiqui, who's a fantastic actor, and he's one of the few Bollywood stars who's gone into Hollywood, because usually they don't want to. They want to stay in their own industry. And he was, for those of you who watch Hollywood rather than Bollywood, he was in a film called Lion, wasn't he? Was it Lion?
No.
No, which is the one he was in? Sorry, which one? Lunchbox is not Hollywood.
Yeah.
Which is the one he was in
Really?
Irfan Khan. Okay, now we'll have to... I'll tell you during the Q&A outside when we do books. He's a phenomenal... No, he was in Lion, sorry. He plays that chilling scene where he's in the movie for 1 minute. Can you Google it? Can someone just Google was Nawazuddin Siddiqui in Lion? I'm sure it was him. That's it, he was, yes, okay, so he was. So Nawazuddin Siddiqui is in Lion, and there's a point where the little boy thinks he's been saved, and he's really about to be trafficked. And Nawazuddin Siddiqui is in the...
Oh, you're right.
He's
in
the film.
Yes.
See, and you made me doubt myself.
Right.
He's in the thing for 3 seconds, and you just feel chills all over. You're so frightened by him. So sorry, that aside. When he played Bal Thackeray, I don't know if you saw the media around that, he then gave a series of interviews praising Bal Thackeray and how much he's been a part of Mumbai culture.
That's right.
And it's really at odds with at least the Pakistani history. I always find it a really interesting comparison. Under Zia-ul Haq, when Pakistan was forced to obey certain dictates, in media, in television, in theater, they just refused. And they paid a phenomenal price for it. So Zia-ul Haq, when he was censoring the press defied him. And Zia-ul Haq's government publicly whipped journalists in stadiums. You know, poets that like Habib Jalib and Faiz Ahmad Faiz, who spoke and wrote against the dictatorship, had to leave their country. And I keep giving this example because I think it's so powerful. After Faiz had to leave Pakistan for his poetry, Iqbal Bano stood up in Lahore at a concert and sang his poetry to a packed room. And eventually the junta in Pakistan ended her career. You know, she couldn't appear on television anymore. She couldn't give concerts. It was 10 years before she could perform again. But the Indian example, as you very correctly said, is they're not saying anything. They don't say anything. So, you know, I haven't really heard Amir Khan say anything. Yeah. Salman Khan has done the opposite. He's kind of been overly enthusiastic about the government. Shah Rukh hasn't said anything. Nawazuddin Siddiqui hasn't. None of them are saying anything. But at the same time, neither are the actors who belong to the majority. I don't see anyone saying anything. And it's a question of, I mean, are they afraid? Maybe. I mean, but in Pakistan, Iqbal Bano was also afraid. But she acted. So I don't know. I find it really worrying to watch. I don't know if you saw this as well, but Lata Mangeshkar was just a guest on Modi's radio show, and was you know, the show I guess was about the Prime Minister, not Lata, and Lata said that you're changing the face of our nation. You know, you've changed the face of India, which I think is true, just not in the way the two of them might have meant it.